My daughter sat on the edge of my bed, handed me a stack of papers, and smiled. It's just a power of attorney, Mom. To pelt while you're sick, I was running a fever of 102. My hand was already reaching for the pen. Then I heard my sister's voice. Not out loud, just a memory. Never sign anything you haven't read, Sophia. I pulled my hand back. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with rest. 3 days later, my best friend read every page and looked up at me. This isn't a power of attorney. This is you signing away everything Ruth left you. They almost got away with it. Almost. My name is Sophia Moore. I am 68 years old, and I live in Asheville, North Carolina, in a house I have owned for 22 years. I have a cat named Pepper who is 14 and moves like he knows exactly how old he is. I have a backyard garden I have never once let go, not through a hard winter, not through a bad diagnosis, not through any of the years that tried to break me. I spent 38 years as a pharmacist at a community drugstore 2 miles from this house. I knew my customers by name, by medication, by which grandchild had just started walking. When I retired 4 years ago, they gave me a cake and a card signed by 3 generations of the same family. I thought that was going to be the most emotional thing my later years had in store. I was wrong about that. Have you ever lost someone who was such a quiet, steady part of your life that you didn't even realize how much space they took up? Until they were gone? My sister Ruth was 5 years older than me. She never married, never seemed to want to. She lived alone in a small yellow house on the east side of town and kept her life extremely orderly. Our father had left her a commercial building in downtown Asheville when he passed, a 2-story brick property he bought in the 70s for almost nothing. Ruth managed it the way she managed everything. Quietly, carefully, with a ledger she updated by hand every single month. She was a bookkeeper by trade. Numbers were her first language. Sunday mornings, I would drive over and we would sit at her kitchen table with coffee and the old radio on the counter that only got 2 stations clearly. She had a mug with a chipped rim she refused to throw away because it had been our mother's. I teased her about it every single week. She would just shrug and pour. Ruth died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in January, alone in that yellow house, and I did not find out until her neighbor called me at nearly noon. She was 73. She was supposed to have more time. 3 weeks after the funeral, Gerald Owens called my house on a Wednesday afternoon. Ruth's attorney. I had met him twice at holiday gatherings, a careful, unhurried man. He asked if I could come in. He said there were things about the estate I needed to understand before any paperwork moved forward. His voice was not alarmed, exactly, but it was deliberate in a way that made me sit down before I answered. Gerald's office smelled like old paper and wood polish. He sat across from me at a desk that had probably been in that room for 30 years, and he told me, in that careful way of his, that Ruth had left me everything. The building, the leases, all of it, estimated value somewhere around $1.4 million. I remember staring at the framed mountain watercolor on the wall behind him because I didn't know where else to put my eyes. Would you have seen it coming? Or would you have been just as blindsided? 4 days later, I came down with a flu that flattened me. Started as a scratchy throat at breakfast, fever of 102 by dinner. I called in a prescription for myself. Pharmacists aren't supposed to do that, but sometimes we do. And I piled every blanket I owned onto the bed and waited it out. Renee showed up the next morning. My daughter, 41 years old. I hadn't seen her in 4 months. She was standing at my front door, holding a container of chicken soup from the place on Marymount Avenue that I have always liked, her hair pulled back the way she wore it in college. She helped me to the couch, heated the soup, and sat across from me while I ate. For a few hours, it felt like something had quietly repaired itself between us. I didn't ask about anything. I was just glad she was there. He arrived on the second day, John Nelson, executive director at Lakeview Medical Group. 20 minutes outside the city. The man Renee had mentioned once at dinner, in the careful way you say a name you've rehearsed. He came in behind her, carrying a small bouquet of grocery store flowers, still wrapped in plastic, rubber band around the stems. He set them on the kitchen counter without asking where I kept vases. Shook my hand, said he'd heard so much about me, and sat down at my kitchen table like he'd done it 100 times before. Ah, I think about that moment a lot now. The flowers, the ease of it. He had a way of talking that sounded helpful on the surface, confident about estate procedures, about how things could get complicated if the right steps weren't taken quickly. I was running a fever. I was catching words but not full shape. On the third evening, Renee sat on the edge of my bed and handed me a stack of papers. She said it was a temporary power of attorney, just something to help with the estate while I wasn't feeling well. John Nelson stood in the doorway. He started walking me through the language, moving quickly, and I remember my hand was already reaching for the pen on the nightstand before I had read a single line. Then Ruth's voice came back to me, not dramatically, just a plain memory, her at her kitchen table, years ago, telling me, "Never sign anything you haven't read, Sophia. It doesn't matter who's handing it to you." I pulled my hand back. I told them I wanted to keep the papers overnight. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with rest. Renee said, "Of course." John Nelson smiled with his mouth. They left, and I listened to the car back out of the driveway. Have you ever had someone's old words save you from a decision you were seconds away from making? Shirley came over before 9 the next morning, retired nurse, my closest friend for 40 years. She sat beside my bed and read through every page of that document without saying a word. When she finished, she set it on the quilt and looked at me. "Sophia," she said, "this is not a power of attorney. This is a full relinquishment of your inheritance rights." I was sitting in old pajamas, hair not brushed, holding papers my daughter had handed me with a warm smile 2 days after not calling for 4 months. I didn't cry. I just looked at the floor and thought about the soup still in the refrigerator. Thought about how Renee had tucked the blanket up when I fell asleep on the couch. I tried to figure out how much of those 2 days had been real. That night, I sat at the kitchen table after Shirley went home. I had boiled water and forgotten it. The light above the stove was on, the small one. The rest of the house was dark. Pepper jumped up on the table, and I put my hand on his back and just let him stay there. There was nothing I wanted to say out loud yet. I just sat in that small circle of yellow light and let the quiet tell me what I already knew. I called Gerald Owens the next morning at 8:30. He told me 2 things, and I wrote both down on the notepad by the phone because my hands needed something to do. First, the document Renee had handed me was legally unenforceable. Ruth had established a living trust years earlier. The building could not transfer to anyone without my signature, in person, in Gerald's office, with proper notarization. What John Nelson had given Renee to hand me was a piece of paper that looked official and meant nothing. Second, Ruth had left a sealed envelope in Gerald's care. One instruction written on the front, in her careful block letters: "Open only when Sophia asks for it." I drove to his office that same afternoon. Shirley sat beside me while Gerald placed the envelope on the desk. Standard white envelope, sealed with tape. Ruth's handwriting on the front. I opened it myself. Inside was a small green notebook, spiral bound, worn cover, the kind you can buy at any drugstore. Ruth had filled it for nearly 2 years. Date in the upper left corner of every entry, in her bookkeeper's hand. She had written down things she noticed during visits to Renee at Lakeview. Insurance claims for patients whose names didn't match any appointment records. Services billed at rates that didn't correspond to the procedures listed. She recorded everything plainly, not accusatory, just the way she recorded everything, and tucked inside the back cover, a photocopy of a prescription authorization form. The signature at the bottom read Sophia Moore, RPH. I had never seen that form before in my life. I sat there a long time just staring at my own handwriting. Whoever had copied my signature had studied it carefully. The way I loop the S, the way I connect the letters without lifting the pen. Ruth had seen that form during a visit, understood exactly what it meant, and kept the copy without ever saying a word to me. She had been protecting me from something she wasn't even sure I knew was happening. She died before she could tell me herself, so she told Gerald instead. And Gerald kept the envelope, and here it was. What would you have done next? Confronted your daughter right then, or done what Sophia did? I went back to what I had spent 38 years doing. I submitted a formal request to the North Carolina State Board of Pharmacy for a complete copy of my license activity and any authorization documents bearing my credentials. The clerk pulled the file while I stood at the counter. I carried that folder to my car and sat in the parking lot before I opened it. I needed to be ready. 3 instances of my forged signature, all within 14 months, all connected to Lakeview Medical Group. Shirley and I went through everything at my kitchen table over 2 afternoons, the light coming through the window over the sink, tea going cold while we matched dates and billing codes. She caught things I would have missed. We made a clean summary, gave it to Gerald, and he sent it to the state insurance fraud office that same week. I want to be honest about how that felt. It did not feel like power. It felt like doing the only thing available to me that was still true to who I was. My whole career, I made sure what was written on a document matched what actually happened to a patient. This was just that, applied somewhere I never expected to reach. About a week later, Renee called, asked if she could see me. Just us, without John. I said, come at 2. When she arrived, I didn't invite her inside. I unlocked the passenger door of my car, and we sat in the driveway with the engine off. She cried almost immediately. She said that when she first started at Lakeview, John had asked her to make small corrections in the billing software changing a diagnostic code here, reclassifying a service there. He called it optimization, said every practice did it. By the time she understood what she was actually doing, her name was on 14 months of altered records, and John had made sure of it. He told her that if she went to anyone, she would face charges first. He said it the way someone says something they have thought through in advance. I listened to all of it without speaking. When she finished, I asked her one question, whether she had known someone was using my name on pharmacy authorization forms. She looked down at her hands. Then she nodded. It was a very small nod, but it was there. I looked out through the windshield at the street. A neighbor was walking a dog I didn't recognize. The leaves on the oak at the end of the driveway had started to turn at the edges. I needed 1 full minute before I said anything, because I knew whatever came next would matter for a long time. I told Renee to call Gerald before the end of the day and to tell him everything she had just told me, all of it, without deciding in advance what to leave out. That was the only thing I could do for her right now. She got out of the car and walked to her own without looking back. Was Sophia wrong to give Renee that chance, or was that exactly the right thing to do? Gerald scheduled the estate meeting for a Thursday morning. Conference room, rectangular table, 6 chairs. Agent Pauline Marsh from the State Fraud Investigation Office sat across from us with a folder she didn't open right away. John Nelson arrived 7 minutes late with his own attorney, who uncapped a pen before he'd fully sat down. John nodded at me when he came in. The kind of nod that assumes an outcome. Gerald read Ruth's trust aloud, every clause. When he finished, he set it down and placed the green notebook on the center of the table. Agent Marsh stood up, introduced herself, said she had a few matters to discuss before the estate transfer could proceed. I watched John Nelson's face change. Just a small recalibration behind the eyes. The moment a person realizes the room was built before they walked into it. I reached into my bag and took out the letter from the State Board of Pharmacy. 2 pages, 3 instances of my forged signature. I set it on the table, smoothed it once with my hand, and looked at him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain it. 38 years working with prescriptions taught me that accurate documentation doesn't require a speech. It only requires that someone read it. His attorney leaned over and said something close to his ear. John Nelson didn't respond. He looked at the board letter, then at the notebook, then at Gerald. By the time Gerald finished summarizing the terms of transfer, Agent Marsh had already moved to the other side of the table. John Nelson was arrested on federal insurance fraud charges 3 days later. Lakeview closed pending investigation the following week. Renee gave investigators a complete account. The state offered her a suspended sentence and community service hours in exchange for her cooperation. I did not call the prosecutor's office. I did not write a letter for her or against her. I told Gerald to let the process move the way it was designed to move. The building passed to me without any further difficulty. The 2 tenants, a physical therapy office on the ground floor, a small bookkeeping firm on the second, both stayed at the same lease rates. I didn't raise them. It didn't feel right to gain anything beyond what Ruth had already given me. I went home after the paperwork was signed, made a pot of coffee, and sat in the backyard. Pepper found a patch of sun on the steps and settled into it. The garden needed weeding along the back fence. I looked at it for a while, thought I'd get to it later in the week. Renee and I have coffee on Saturday mornings now. A place on the west side of town, neutral ground. We never stay more than an hour. The conversations are shorter than they used to be, but they're more honest than they ever were. She calls on Tuesday evenings. Some weeks we talk for 20 minutes. Some weeks less. It is not what it was. I don't know yet what it's going to become, but it's something real, and that is more than we had before. I decided to use part of the rental income to open a free consultation service. 3 mornings a week for older adults in Asheville who don't have adequate prescription coverage or who can't make sense of what their doctors have prescribed them. Shirley handles intake on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We work out of a rented room at a community center 2 miles from my house. Nobody pays. Nobody needs to. Ruth used to say that knowledge is the one thing you can give away without losing it. It took me a long time to understand she wasn't just talking about bookkeeping. Most mornings now, I'm in the garden before the day gets too warm. Pepper stretches out on the back step, one paw hanging off the edge. The tomatoes I put in late are starting to come in. Everything looks the way it always has. Ordinary and mine. I am 68 years old, and I am only just beginning to live the way I actually want to. So here is what I want to ask you. If you had been sitting in that car in your driveway, your daughter in the passenger seat with tears on her face, what would you have done? Would you have said what Sophia said? Or something different? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, you know what to do. There is more where this came from, and I would love for you to be here for it.